Welcome to Module 4.1, Managing the Buyer's Experience. Here with Cory Bray to talk about this really critical topic. Thank you for joining us, Cory.
It's important.
It is. Especially nowadays. Buyers are flooded with information. We all know that buyers have a very different journey. So we'd love to hear your thoughts on the key question. Why is it crucially important to manage the buyer's experience?
Because they have so many options. And
Do explain.
They can go down different paths. Mm-hmm. They can go over here, they can go over there. They read stuff on the internet that might have been relevant to your company 3 or 4 years ago, and that might be impacting their opinion of you today. So managing the experience so you're able to uncover the problems that they're trying to solve, you're able to demonstrate how your product or service solves those problems, and you can guide them to making a decision that's either that they don't want to do business with you or that they do.
So someone who's new to the idea of managing the experience might conflate that with trying to drive a specific selling process.
No.
How do you separate those two?
Well, all you're trying to do is get the truth. Mm-hmm. You're not trying to force anybody or connive or cajole them into doing something specific. You simply want to understand the truth. And the other thing to keep in mind is that as a salesperson of your company's product, you're the expert at selling your company's product. This person doesn't make these types of buying decisions very often, especially in B2B sales. If you think about how often they make specific types of purchases, it's not often, and they do it to solve a pain point that, if not solved, could be catastrophic for their company or themselves. So it's a high-risk solution where they're not experts at executing that buying process. It's a risk for them. And so managing it and helping them go along that journey and make sure that they're getting what they need from you is really important.
Okay, so I bought in, I believe it's important, but let's imagine I'm a brand new rep. I know the product really well because I've gone through the product training.
Sure, yeah, of course you have. Hopefully not the first week.
No, we started off with buyer personas in the market, so we're in a better state.
Yeah.
And I'm ready to handle it. I've got this lead that came in.
Yep.
And based on their early cues, I know they've already read a lot. They've looked at other vendors. I want them to have an excellent experience. What are the levers that I have to pull to manage that? What are the tools and techniques that I've got?
You can fax them a contract, or you can not do that.
I'm going to go with option B.
The greatest tool a salesperson has to manage the buying process is to ask questions. Because I've said this before, the person who's asking the questions is the one who controls the conversation.
So thinking about that, it's also easy to say, though, if I want the buyer to have a good experience, I'm helping them, I'm serving them, I'm facilitating. How do you reconcile that with the idea of asking questions?
Well, facilitating is an interesting word. Imagine that they're coming to me and they're going to buy a CRM product, for example, to where they're going to keep track of all their accounts and their contacts and their opportunities. That's a big purchase. And like I said before, they hadn't necessarily gone through this purchasing process before, but I can facilitate this thing, say, well, y'all use NetSuite, right? Like, oh yeah, we use NetSuite. When you bought NetSuite, what was the process that you went through to make that purchasing decision? So I'm facilitating them either remembering or going and doing some internal research to understand what it was like back then. That gives me clarity around how their organization buys, and then I can either accept that process and guide them through it, or I can interject my expertise and talk about how other customers that we've worked with have found success evaluating our product.
So it sounds like a good question is helping your sales team understand the information they need, but helping that buyer feel and act more like an expert buyer as well.
Yeah. You want to, going back to the scale framework where we measure rapport, you want to positively impact their status. Help them understand that they're an expert and they're not doing anything wrong. They're at a logical turning point in their company's journey, and that's why it's time to look at buying something new.
So as a sales rep, if I think about the actions that I need to do, we'll have meetings or we're sharing information, but we'll have a lot of conversations where we're building alignment or booking appointments. What are some of the things I can keep in mind to make sure that those activities, like booking an appointment, where maybe I'm not asking questions, how can I make sure that I'm driving a good buying experience even through those routine activities?
Well, you're using the plan framework that we talked about in the prior module at the top of the meeting and the bottom of the meeting. So you're not getting off a conversation with a prospect and then sending them an email and saying, hey, can we schedule our next conversation? You're doing it in the meeting. You're booking a meeting while you're in the meeting. And you're doing that again, through questions.
So being prepped can make sure that we're moving each conversation forward and avoiding thrashing with extraneous emails and schedules.
Yeah, exactly. You should always have that next meeting on the calendar before you leave the current one.
Okay, so I'm hearing great questions, kind of being prepped in that process. Great comment on the scale framework, and I know we'll come back to that. But you also said something interesting earlier. You said the person who asks questions is controlling the conversation. We'll often hear reps stressed by the dilemma, or at least the perceived dilemma, between meeting the buyer where they're at and accommodating that versus controlling the conversation or the buying process. Do you see those as intention?
And when you say meeting the buyers, because they're asking them questions. So ask me a question. Anything.
So how was your trip to come visit us?
It was great. I had a layover, but it's okay. Do you enjoy layovers or do you like direct flights?
Generally, I go on direct.
I'm in control.
There you go. But we did meet each other where we're at.
We did.
Fantastic. So thinking about that, great questions, great way to keep control of that conversation. On that topic of control, one of the other things that I've heard some leaders say is, as a rep, just because you're giving the buyer a great experience and you're managing that experience, doesn't mean you can't assert yourself. You can't push back.
Sure.
Can you share some of the situations where it's okay for a rep to push back on what they want or need for that process while still giving the buyer a good experience?
Yeah, some of the best salespeople I've worked with understand that at points in time, they've got to question what the buyer has said or push back a little bit on what's being proposed on their end. And they find that there's a lot of success if you do that elegantly.
Okay.
Did you see what I just did there?
I thought you did a great job there.
What technique did I use?
Well, you were sharing both the feedback and what you've heard before.
Yeah.
And validating what I had said.
I gave you a customer story. Perfect. And so that's the best way to do it, is you use these social proof stories where you're talking about how other people have done it in the past. And
That was stealthy.
it was super stealthy, and it works really well. And so if you're sitting here and I want to say, Joseph, that's wrong, I can't say that's wrong because that knocks down your status. Now we've broken rapport. You don't trust me. And when I ask you questions, you don't answer them openly and honestly. But if I say, Joseph, I got to tell you, 90% of the buyers that I've worked with in the past at this point in the conversation, they're prepared to do X.
Well, let's give that another try and see if we can find another example.
Yeah.
Just to highlight for people who might have missed that.
Sure.
One of the things I've heard a sales leader say is that the best way to help your customers get to yes is to say yes a lot yourself. Is that great advice? I feel like we should be following that.
I've heard this, and say yes 3 times so they say yes. That sounds like you're trying to trick them. And we don't want to trick them, we want to get the truth. Because if I get you to say the word yes, well, first of all, that's not even a good question in my mind. Getting someone to say yes or no. The types of questions that we like to ask, especially when we're doing product demos or when we're really uncovering some pain from somebody, are questions that start with words like what and how. How would this feature be useful in your day-to-day workflow? That's what I want to hear. I want to hear them say it would be useful for these reasons and it would prevent these other bad things from happening. I don't want to hear them say something like, how would this, or would this feature be useful? And they say yes. I can't go back to, because all we're doing is we're creating assets to go back to later in the selling conversation. I can say, Joseph, when we talked last time, you mentioned that this feature would be useful for these reasons. That's good. Then you're saying, yeah, I did say that. But if I say, hey, Joseph, last time I asked you if this feature would be useful and you said yes, that's not very compelling.
Those are great examples. I love how we've pushed back. I love how we talked about how to handle those objections. One of the other frameworks that you shared was how to handle that in what's often a tense situation when you're negotiating.
Right.
How do you make sure that a buyer has a good experience in those situations that are sometimes confrontational?
Well, the negotiation should never be confrontational.
Explain.
You should just understand first of all, what are you willing to give up? What are you willing to trade? And then look at what they really care about and what they're trying to accomplish over there. And if their ask is unreasonable, then you can push back. And you can also use management as the bad person in that example. And so it's not you telling them no.
So how do we help a sales rep who finds themselves in that situation where they've gone through a fantastic prospecting and discovering process, a fantastic demo, the prospect is interested, they're ready for that proposal, and the prospect comes back and says, that price is not okay, and that rep is full of anxiety that they're no longer delivering the right buyer experience.
Sure.
What advice do we give that rep?
Well, you refer back to the pain that you uncovered. For example, if you told me that all these bad things are happening, and ideally you might have told me how much that's costing you, now I can refer back to it and say, Joseph, you mentioned that you've got this problem that's costing you $1 million a week, but now this price is too expensive. Did I miss something?
Fantastic open-ended question. Gives them the opportunity to say no and validate you, or share the thing that you missed.
Yeah, because you might not have missed anything. It might be the case that they've only got $20,000 signature authority. Then, can we do a pilot? Have you done pilots before with other organizations to prove out the use case and then expand it to a larger purchase later on?
And having a question like that, you're keeping control of the conversation.
You just got to ask questions. The minute you start answering the questions, you lose complete control and you limit your ability to uncover new information.
Fantastic. So I think we've done a great job of doubling down on the reason why the buyer experience is really important. Shared some great highlights. I'd like to ask for kind of one last piece of advice. If you're talking to a brand new sales rep, they're new to technology, they're new to their sales role, and they say, hey, Cory, I'd love to make sure I'm managing my buyer's experiences really well.
Yeah.
What should I do? How would you give that advice to them?
I want to make sure, well, at first I'd diagnose if they are or not. And the way to understand if you're managing your buyer experience is, well, do your buyers ever go dark where they just stop responding to you? Do they ever fail to introduce you to other people in the organization that you think you should get to meet? Do they lie to you? If any of those things are present, then you don't have strong rapport and you're not managing the buyer experience well. So I think diagnosing and looking for potential landmines is definitely something to focus on prior to just trying to do everything right, because you don't know what those signals are on the positive ends, but you definitely know what the signals are on the negative end.
Love it. So before we even work on improving it, let's do that diagnosis, figure out what the rough spots are, and then we can fix it.
Yeah, and you use the SCALE framework to do that: status, certainty, autonomy, likeness, and equity. And if we've maintained all of the SCALE drivers, then you should be in good shape.
Perfect. Thank you so much for those insights, and thank you for sharing that, Cory. That was excellent.
Thanks, Joseph.
Thanks everyone for joining us. Looking forward to our next session, and in the meantime, happy selling.